Good morning and welcome to another edition of Dive In with Captain Sean. I'm Captain Sean, your host. Today we're going to be going over Svalbard, which is probably one of my favorite places in the world to cruise. And we've got a real special guest. We've got Jason Roberts, who I'll be introducing in just a second. Uh, the and let's just jump right in. So Svalbard, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the history of Svalbard, what's great about cruising in Svalbard, and showing you some amazing photos and video, which I took while I was up. Actually, myself and my crew took while we were cruising the Svalbard archipelago. The Now, when I do these kind of, I guess, webinars or YouTube webinars, I like to pick a featured boat. And on the very first one that we did, which will be available on YouTube probably sometime next week, which was on Greece, I did Asteria because she happened to be in Greece, and that happens also to be in the Worth Avenue fleet. And today's special vessel is also going to be Asteria. Asteria is really suited for the Arctic. This is a picture that I took of her up in Greenland last summer. There's another one up in the ice in Greenland. And then this great drone shot of her going through the ice. Now, Asteria and Latitude were the two boats which I had up in the Arctic. And Latitude was repack design and a fantastic vessel for cruising the Arctic. But I got to admit, Asteria, with that big fat bow, she pulls off a big pressure wave. Whereas in Latitude, in heavy ice, I could only go about 2 knots, and I'll talk a little bit about more of that later. I could do about 5 knots through the ice on Asteria. She was a great boat going through heavy ice, especially the stuff that you're even seeing right there. Now, a little bit about Svalbard. Where is Svalbard? Svalbard is it's an archipelago north of Norway, way up in the Arctic Circle. You can see just how close it is to the North Pole. Now, who owns Svalbard? Well, the Norwegians manage the archipelago, but we're going to talk to Jason a little bit exactly about how Svalbard's managed and how the government's set up and the other unique features that it has. Now, one of the really cool features that Svalbard has is the World Seed Bank. Now, if you're not familiar with the World Seed Bank is where the entire world supply of seeds are. So your pumpkins, your blueberries, your everything, different strains of those are all in this giant vault up in the Arctic. Jason's got a good story about that as well. Now this is inside the World Seed Bank. Now you'll see a guy with a rifle there. Now the rifles are not because they're looking to get robbed by seed pirates. No, up in Spitsbergen and Svalbard, everybody carries a rifle, and that's for the polar bears. Now, polar bears can be, they're super sneaky. They're the apex predator. They will actively hunt human beings. You've got to be really careful. There's warning signs for polar bears all over. Now, most of the time, they're just looking for food. In Churchill, in Canada, they have a big problems about the polar bears going behind restaurants and stealing food and stuff. And sometimes they'll even break into your homes and steal food. They're super cute and you want to pet them, but they can be highly aggressive. And remember, if you have any food around, you want to make sure that you keep it away from the polar bears. Of course, you might recognize these two polar bears. These are from the movie The Golden Compass, which is a perfect segue into talking about Jason Roberts. Jason Roberts, as well as being the founder of PolarX, which is the world's logistics leader in the polar regions, and that includes also Antarctica. Jason is also an award-winning producer for such series as Frozen Planet. He's worked on movies like The Golden Compass and a whole bunch of other ones. Here he is with 2 bears and up in the North Pole. And now I'd like to introduce our special guest, Jason Roberts. Good morning, Jason.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you to everyone for joining. Thank you for putting everyone together for this discussion about Svalbard. So it's always interesting to talk about the place I call home for the last 35 years.
So you are living on Spitsbergen in Svalbard.
Yes, I moved to Svalbard in the late 1980s, 1989 actually, for a 14 days job to help a friend build a trapper's cabin who was a fur trapper, and I never left. Well, that's not true. I have left a few times, but you can see it doesn't do good you any good the mental state. But no, we based ourselves here, and we've seen a lot of change the last 3 decades of Svalbard being both the Svalbard and also the polar regions. I mean, 3 decades ago, no one talked about the polar regions, but today there's an interest in science, there's geopolitics, and also an interest the cruise. You know, when I think back in the 90s, we had on the super yacht market, we had one boat every decade that was interested in the polar regions. Now we have many, both in the Arctic and Antarctic. So
And that might be a little bit towards the voyages that we did on Latitude. So what right now is you're looking at is kind of an itinerary map. I use an itinerary builder, which helps me put together these itineraries, which will be available to anyone that's signed up for this, or if anybody that wants it, you can email me at sean@worthavenueyachts.com. I'd be happy to send it to you. But obviously, you can see a lot of overland routes on here. It's because that the computer program that I'm using really doesn't understand what how to actually navigate Svalbard, but all the destinations in there. Now there are thousands of destinations in Svalbard. We're just going to go over a couple of the highlights. Longyearbyen is of course the capital.
Right.
Go ahead. Sorry, Jason.
Break in there just with a point that destinations. It's cruising in the Arctic more so than Antarctica. Antarctica needs a bit of planning on destinations because of anchorages, wildlife, permitting. But the Arctic, you know, it's often people want itineraries based day to day, but it's all the weather and the ice, to be honest. Whether you're on Svalbard, Greenland, or northern Canada, you know, most places you're quite open to go where you'd like to go if there's no environmental restrictions. And then, you know, we also have to remember we just did a fleet of super yachts on Svalbard, where I think the only regret that the captain had was didn't have enough time.
Yeah, and that's something that I've explained to owners and people that want to cruise the Arctic. I had a gentleman that wanted me to take his boat to the Arctic, and he was on a very strict timeline, actually specifically through the Northwest Passage. And I told him, I said, well, you can't have a specific timeline. And he goes, well, why not? It's just a certain amount of miles. And I said, no. I was explaining them to him. I said, we might not even get through. The ice could be really heavy that year, or we could get certain passages that we need to get through blocked in. It's which kind of makes it fun and exciting. Now, one of the services that you provide and that you provided for me was guiding services. This is a picture of Einar way up on White Island. And so tell us about a little bit about the guide. Like, well, often you guide as well. So tell us a bit about your guides and what exactly the guides do while they're on board.
I mean, it's very, I don't, in a way, the word guide is used slightly incorrectly, because in a way it's more logistics and coordinating and safety, as well as also giving the principal, you know, the most out of their maybe once in a lifetime experience. So, and we run a company that primarily works with international film productions, doing big films, whether natural history, nature films, or Hollywood documentaries or feature films. So the good thing is that, you know, we are all locals, and you know, someone maybe is not the best title to call them a guide. Maybe it's a local expert with a logistical background to be able to go to places, because exactly where Einar's standing is one of the remotest places in the Arctic, called Kramerpinten, where for many years, you know, people don't access there because of the heavy ice conditions. It's one of my favorite locations in the whole Arctic, because in a way it's also inaccessible and not many people ever get to go there. But it's having that local knowledge, which I think really helps. And also in the planning stages, it helps us a lot if we get a very good brief on the principal and the guests, because of course, first trip we did together, you had quite a special principle. On his 70th birthday, you can hike a 15K hike, and he just complains the whole way, but actually has a lovely day. Where not everyone can do a 15K hike. Some people want to do a lot of water sports. So in the planning stages, it's quite good to get an idea of the guests and principals' desires and what they want to do. So.
Well, again, Neil Thadani was on the owner of Latitude, was exceptional. We'll talk a little bit more about him and that trip that we did when we talk about the kind of the ideal itinerary. Well, we can actually talk about that right now. You were saying the ideal length of time, well, not ideal, but a decent length of time is be 8 to 10 days, whereas we spent 6 weeks up there, and we could have easily spent another 4 weeks if we hadn't run out of daylight and things weren't freezing.
That's a perfect example. I mean, the trip before your trip, we had planned a 3-day trip with moving the vessel from Boston to Svalbard for a 3-day trip, and actually the principal loved it so much he stayed for 6.5 days before he had to fly out quickly. So when I got the call from you guys and got told 6 weeks to 12 weeks or whatever, how long did we need? I was a bit like, do you mean 6 days? So I think for the average person who just wants a touch of wildlife and a touch of the Arctic, then minimum 8 to 10 days is good for Svalbard. And then it's very much up to the individual. Some people, you can, as you said, we could have easily gone until it got completely dark and the oceans had frozen over, because if the guests are enjoying it, there's enough stuff to do wildlife, historical, adventure wise. But, some people also think a good 8-10 days is enough of that.
Well, we were just getting rolling at that point. And, we, again, starting in Longyearbyen, which was a really unique place. And then one of the coolest little things that we did, which was just right across that little bay, where we were able to photograph those foxes and the reindeer, and that was a wonderful, wonderful day. The variety of wildlife that I found in Svalbard was just great. And what I liked about it compared to the Northwest Passage or other parts of the Arctic that I've cruised, it's much more concentrated. You can go take a day trip and go across there and we found hundreds of foxes, those little foxes, and they were super cute. And then we had the reindeer. We get some great shots there. And we had the reindeer that were there as well. That was just a wonderful, wonderful day of photographing wildlife and seeing something that was really spectacular. And it was relatively close to Longyearbyen. And I remember that we decided to go, that when we first got there, we actually had gone up into some areas that we'll talk about in a minute. But when like you said, the weather being unpredictable, being based out of Longyearbyen, we were able to do a bunch of cool little quick trips. Now, one of the other trips that we did, and this is fascinating given kind of the geopolitical state of the world, was this town, which was Pyramiden, which is also relatively close to Longyearbyen. And so tell us, I think Pyramiden is one of the coolest places that I've ever seen. It's like going back into some type of time capsule. But tell us a little bit about kind of the history of that and what's happening now regarding the Russians and the war in the Ukraine.
On the geopolitics, Svalbard is part of the Kingdom of Norway, but any signatory nation has equal economical rights. So Svalbard has always been very central in geopolitics between the East and West. Of course, now with the war in Ukraine has come closer and closer to the Arctic as well. So Pyramiden, the Soviet Union from the 1930s always had a presence on Svalbard. The main presence being Barentsburg, which is still operational, and Pyramiden. Pyramiden at the height had about 1,500 people, where Barentsburg had about 3,000 people. Pyramiden was let go to ruins in 1998. So throughout the 1990s, at the collapse of the Soviet Union and the start of the Russian Federation, you could see the collapse of their activities on Spitsbergen, as they call the archipelago Svalbard. And then recently, with the build-up in the Russian Federation of economics and politics, they have been also building up their presence again on Svalbard. So there has changed a lot in the last 2 years of the war in Ukraine on Svalbard with the politics. We tend to keep that international and not local, but there's always, it's interesting to walk back in time. You can walk in the pyramid and you're going back into the Soviet Union, not the Russian Federation, but the Soviet Union as it was. I totally agree. It's not only its amazing ruins from the Soviet period, it's also because there's lots of those in the Russian Federation. But the great thing with Pyramid is they dumped it next to this beautiful mountain and this amazing glacier behind it. So whichever way you look at it, it just looks like a Hollywood set. It just doesn't look real.
It really doesn't. And when I was walking through there, and I was getting deja vu like you wouldn't believe. And I actually said to one of the deckhands I was with, Ben, we were walking by this building, and I said, Ben, on the other side of this building, there's a shed, and in that shed, there's a generator. And sure enough, there was. And Ben was like, how did you know that? And I said, I don't know. And so anyway, we went back to the boat, and I told Einar that, and he started laughing, and he goes, have you ever played Call of Duty? And I said, yes. And he goes, they used this as one of the maps on the video game. And I went, oh. I said, that's how I knew. That's why I knew exactly where everything was. It was really fascinating. But
if you want to have a scary moment, walk through Pyramid alone in the middle of the dark period in December.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, which I've done before.
It would be something like out of a Stephen King meets The Thing.
You do get spooked, but it's not a place to spend a huge. It's a half-day's visit. The wonderful thing with Pyramid is that you're within a stone's throw or a quick warm break to jump across to the glaciers to the east of it, Northern Shelbrian, which is a very old ice and very blue ice. So you can easily do a glacial walk in the morning and a Soviet town visit in the afternoon.
And that's exactly what we did. Is that I didn't put that on as a destination. Because there are but the one just like if you look at the map right now where the dot is to the right, I think that was where there was a really cool ice cave there.
Yeah. That's a very old ice. It's flowing very slow, so it's extremely blue and quite famous for being a blue ice glacial field. Behind Pyramid and up in the valley, you have huge fossil areas for collecting fossils. I mean, it's like so many places in the Arctic. You only just touch it before you move on to the next place. And I see you've jumped now to New Orleans, which is basically the research hub of Svalbard.
Yeah, so tell us. So that was pretty cool when we went there because it was not only. I mean, there are researchers from all over the world. There's big radio telescopes there. There's all sorts of science that happens right at New. God, you better take care of the pronunciation of the Norwegian names, but
it's basically New Ålesund.
New Ålesund. Okay.
Which is a town. Ålesund is a town on the west coast of Norway, so it's a new town that didn't go so successfully. Built it like most things on Svalbard originally as a coal mine. It actually. The Norwegian government's only ever been thrown out of power once, and that was because of a disaster in New Orleans when the mines exploded twice, and then the government was held responsible in the 1960s and 70s. So then they closed it down for mining operations, and now it's built up as an international scientific hub. So there's nations from about 27 different nations that have scientific activities going on through around New Orleans.
So well, I remember walking around there and seeing different consulates from different nations, and then that picture of Amundsen, which I forget now. Why is there a statue of Amundsen there?
Because Amundsen, when he 1923, when he crossed the Arctic Ocean from Spitsbergen to Barrow, Alaska, with Nobel on the airship Norge. They built the mast to tether the airship to. So So they had one in northern Norway, Vadsø, and then they flew from Italy up to northern Norway, from northern Norway across to New Orleans. So he actually stayed in New Orleans for quite a few weeks while waiting for the weather to cross over to Barrow, Alaska.
Yeah, we'll talk about another interesting aeronaut story in a bit. But one of the I think this was one of the first destinations that I went to on Latitude, and this is where we saw literally like our first exposure to walruses and to polar bears, and we really started getting into the wildlife when we got up here.
When you get to the Northwest National Park, you get into kind of alpine mountains going straight into the oceans, and quite a lot of current between all the islands, but also meaning you got a lot of wildlife. You got a huge amount of bird cliffs, walrus colonies, high density of polar bears roaming around, whales off the coast. Yeah, so it's the great thing with Svalbard in geology is you have 7 major types of geology. So the geology from, say, Longyearbyen to the northwest corner is 2 completely different types of geology. So it's like taking all of Greenland and Baffin Island and Ellesmere Island and shrinking it into still a big area. So you still have to realize that Svalbard is 1.5 times the size of Denmark, or the same size as Northern Ireland, 73,000 square kilometers of land mass. So, but with 7 types of geology, from slicing pretty much the islands north to south mostly, you do get a big range in what it looks like, and even though it's all frozen and terribly cold. But
well, it wasn't. I didn't think it was. That's the thing with when you have 24-hour daylight. Even though it was cold, I never felt cold. It was strange. You didn't get that dark, oppressive cold. And
no, exactly, because you have a low humidity even in the summer. In the winter, we have extremely low humidity, so we have a lot of issues with rubbers cracking and furniture cracking because of low humidity, and that's pretty much all year round. So it's a 5 to 15 degrees day on Svalbard feels a bit more like a nice 20 degrees day anywhere else. It's this summer we had quite a warm summer. We had many days which were above 10 degrees Celsius, but that feels like 25 degrees or more. It's t-shirt weather, is as long as there's no wind. If the wind factor is an issue off the glaciers, but as long as there's no wind, it's actually quite warm, and the average temperature is not so cold to be so far north.
Yeah, that was and back to the different types of geology. It was the photographs I was able to take, especially this is one of my favorite pictures that I ever took. And then you go into this national park right here, and then you get, just the different types of geology.
Yeah, so that you're now down in Hornesen in that picture there, and the picture before was in Kongsfjord.
Yeah,
different snow cover, glacial cover, geology. Some places look like Mars with no snow, and it's just
like that.
Like that there, yeah.
Yeah.
And also affects it, the seals in that region where you have the red rock all have red faces because they're all fothering on the mud on the bottom, and their faces get oxidized. So you get bearded seals only in the northwest corner, and New Orleans and up to the northwest corner where you have red-faced bearded seals.
That's wild.
Mm. And then when you head across more to the more you head towards the ice, the higher density polar bears you're going to have. And as we all know, the nicest sighting of bears is actually on the ice, not on land, where you have control over safety as well. And the bears range is on the sea ice, so of course more ice. It's a bit of a balance on the vessel, depending on how good the vessel is with ice, or if it's ice rated at all or not ice rated. But yeah, where you find ice, you'll find bears.
Well, that was that was when we started getting up into these islands. We found we found quite a few bears. What was a little disturbing is that we found a lot of bears that had obviously starved to death. And have you seen that with your experience? Have you seen that more and more?
No, you do find starved to death polar bears, but we die of old age. We're heading that way as well. Sorry to say to everyone watching this. So there's very
Keep it
seldom.
positive, Jason. Keep it positive.
Yeah, we're all heading that direction. But it's very seldom we find bears of younger age that have died. Actually, it is quite seldom, even though the media proclaims the opposite. The Svalbard polar bear population is doing very well. Um, and what you hinted on earlier between, say, the Northwest Passage and Greenland areas where you've cruised as well, and then Svalbard, the proliferance of wildlife. You get to Svalbard, and it's like Jurassic Park,
Yeah.
and so much of that has got to do with humans and over harvest, or calling harvest hunting. So there are areas of the Arctic where you look at the biodiversity, northeast Greenland, for example, where cold water all year, less biodiversity, less all the way from krill all the way through to polar bears. It's all linked together, and you hit Svalbard, which is actually what I also touched on, is relatively warm to be 80 degrees north on average. Compared to anywhere else in the whole Arctic, we are very warm, and that's because of the Gulf Stream and the Atlantic Current hitting Svalbard, which is bringing the warm water, which is creating the nutrients, which is creating the prolific wildlife, whether it's birds, whether it's seals, whether it's fisheries, whether it's polar bears. So we have an incredibly dense wildlife to be the Arctic. We're not the savannas of East Africa in density, but to be the Arctic, Svalbard is very, very special with density of wildlife.
Well, that's what I when people say to me, what's one of your favorite places that you've been to? And I've been to a lot of different places, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to go over them on these series, which will continue. But Svalbard, bar none, is still one of my favorite places on the planet for all the reasons that you've listed, which is the biodiversity, and on land and in the water, the geological diversity, and it's oddly enough, I find it, as remote it was relatively easy to provision up there. You've got a bunch of actually really good restaurants along your bin, and you can get.
I remember taking your principal to Groover, the mining warehouse restaurant.
Yeah.
Photo outside, and he was this is better than anything in Singapore.
Yeah.
Yeah, we Longyearbyen being the capital of Svalbard, I would not say is not an average Arctic town. It's got nothing to do with the rest of the Arctic. It's a little Oslo, a little Geneva, little European city put at the North Pole with all the services. So it makes cruising actually very easy. And I think every captain I work with is always a bit worried about the dangers of cruising, how difficult it's going to be. And everyone that's always pre and always post, they were going, that was one of the easiest cruising seasons I've ever had.
It really is. It's just, well, some of the places that we brought Latitude were far from easy, but we got way off the beaten path. Now, what's interesting about this particular island, and we're going back to kind of the age of the aeronauts, tell us a little bit about these guys.
I was a Swedish expedition, which in the late 1890s tried to balloon to the North Pole. Andre expedition, 4 people on board. Actually, the first year they took off on the northwest corner and they crashed on the island about 500 meters away. But I think they'd promised too much, so they had to come back the year after. But I'm pretty sure they knew they weren't going to get too far. They got to 83.5 degrees north. So they got the furthest north ever, landed on the ice, walked back to that island you have on the map, White Island, which we fell in love with on your trip. And perished on the island. The interesting thing was that they had something with them, which was technology at the time called Eastman, which ended up being Eastman Kodak, which ended up being film. So in the years of the expedition, it was still glass plates, but you couldn't take glass plates on a balloon. due to weight. So they took this new invention called film, which was lucky for us that when their bodies were found 34 years later, by chance, that the film was frozen in the ice and preserved. So the whole history of their disaster was all preserved on film.
I like the fact that they took when they knew that they had to try to hike back or try to survive. One of their critical supplies they brought with them was champagne. It was like they were like, save the champagne. Now, this is a picture of me this is on White Island, and I was calling a friend of mine who I would get weather reports for, and that was on the satellite phone, and he said, take a selfie. And I said, sure. And as I was doing that, behind me up came this guy. And as you know, as I was saying earlier, polar bears can be pretty sneaky. They can sneak up behind you. And he, immediately we got the people off the beach. It was myself and Einar. We stood up and did what we needed to do, but he did stop and pose for photographs, which was they are hams. I gotta give it to him. Now, this is like when we were talking a little bit about earlier. We found a lot of dead bear remains on that island. But the other thing in that photo I want to talk a little bit about, which I found was fascinating, is the volcanic ash that is on that ice, and that came from. Einar was telling me that came from the volcano in Iceland.
That would have been from 2000. Was it 2010?
Yeah.
March, April 2010, and that covered a lot of the snow with volcanic ash. It's ice core samples. You can go back in time by doing ice core samples through that ice, and that ice is White Island's been there for a long time. It's never really melted. It's pretty much a stable ice cap. But you see the ash left behind, and because it was just after that volcanic eruption. It's interesting when you go back in time through the ice, of course, but an island like that, strange how it's so remote and so non-forgiving. I took a friend of mine. We landed where the Swedish balloonist's remains were found, and he was that stage. His father was a good friend, and he unfortunately passed away on an accident on Svalbard snowmobiling. So I took him when he was 12 on a trip around Svalbard, and we went to that island, and we stood there, and I told him the history of the Swedish perishing and dying on that island. He looked around and said something like, well, this is a pretty desolate place to die. But it is desolate, but in a way it has its own beauty.
I personally think that that's one of the most spectacular places that I've ever been. It was otherworldly. The ice, and then with the bears and the walrus and when we came in there, how I would navigate, and we kind of we learned this method. The first time we went through the Northwest Passage, because we didn't have great charts. The charts on this island also were pretty non-existent of where we're going in. So we'd send a tender in to scout out ahead of us, then we would have her go in concentric circles, and then we would very tentatively go in, find a good place to drop the hook. And it was surprisingly good anchorage there. It was we had spectacularly good weather. We decided to leave when the bears started paying a little too much attention to us, and that's when we bailed. We were there for about 2.5-3 days.
I think we lost the internet cable to Martha's Vineyard.
Huh?
Are you back there? We lost you for a second.
Oh, you lost me for a second?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, I was saying I was talking about being up on that island, and then how remote it was, and then the next stop after that, we were going to go to see if we could get above 81 degrees.
And then you went up to 81.5, wasn't it?
81, 25, 14. Yeah, that was fun. I remember being on a panel with Christoph,
Hmm.
who was was on G Machine, and he had gotten up to about 81
Hmm.
the month prior, and then I
Yeah.
got up and beat him just by a little bit.
We can take
And
the next one that wants to beat you. So
Fraser said, "Well, then he got up a little higher than me." I go, "Yeah, but you cheated. You brought an icebreaker with you."
okay, yeah. So it has to be different divisions with support or without support. So,
Absolutely, or ice class, non-ice classed, and Latitude was definitely non-ice classed.
yeah, yeah. But that's a beautiful picture. I think that one of you in the previous picture was taken by the principal aboard.
No, so
Um,
that picture was actually taken by his son-in-law,
your son-in-law.
Lapo.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
Lapo got a great shot, and there's actually, if you look close, there's me on the back of the boat taking a picture of everybody that was on the ice. Now, this shot, it was how we managed to get up there and break the record was like as I said earlier, the fastest I could go through ice was about 2 knots on latitude, preferably just a slightly smaller than that, because excuse me, slower than that, because if we hit anything, given the latitude had a really efficient hull, it was a great design for going through the water, not so great for going through the ice. Asteria has got this big fat bow and sends off this big pressure wave, so it literally tosses the ice out of the way. So a method that I learned the first time I went through the Northwest Passage is that I would find an ice floe that was roughly the width of the vessel, or preferably a little bigger the vessel, and then I would wedge that between the bow and the bulbous bow and use it as a battering ram, and that worked really really well. Like because I could push, I could at that point I could go like 4 knots, and that allowed me. I had a weather window which allowed me to get up to 81.25 using this method and then get out before the wind switched south and the ice back came back in on me, and that's how we did it.
That method is also used if you when we're using the tenders as well, or the small
Yeah,
zodiacs. You can raft yourself on a with a small tender. You can actually raft the tender up on the ice and then just push through the ice, so you're not damaging the tender, you're damaging the ice. The ice is basically your plow in front of you, and you lose a bit of steering, but you can go much faster. So,
yeah. The also we didn't quite make it to the North Pole, but we did manage to see one of Santa's elves up there. So that was we had a quick elf sighting, and as you can see, he was trying to escape as we were going through there. Now, from there, I kind of jumped all the way down to the bottom of the island, and again, getting back to the geological diversity of Svalbard. Tell us a little bit about this.
it's a place not, I call it Stonehenge. I think it might be
Yeah,
officially called something like that as well. I found it by mistake, snowmobiling through it once. Go there quite often. It's in the pitch when it's blown up. You see everyone standing around like little trolls on the different rocks. But that just shows you the geology of Svalbard, the difference between that and an ice wall that's in the northeast island. It's 190 kilometers of glacial front, which is an amazing experience. But you can also have areas of big valleys that look more like the surface of Mars. So there's a lot of diversity. There's lake areas as well. But the only thing you just don't have is any forests, of course, on Svalbard. So,
now, one of the things that you and I talked about, and something that I definitely wanted to do, was keep latitude up over for the winter and ice her in,
mm,
and then use snowmobiles to go out and explore. And then you had actually taken that concept one step further by building kind of like a giant snow train that
mm.
that could go across Svalbard. Tell us, I think that would just be. I still would love to go take a boat up there and ice it in for the winter, and then
We
use it.
were at that stage. We were working a lot about the plan of freezing boats in for the winter.
Yeah,
Um, it's been done before many times. It has its advantages and disadvantages, of course, which is one of the problem is insulation when it getting very cold is insulation piping and that on the boat. But the biggest problem is probably the insurance. Everyone starts flags start going blinking red and in bright colors. So at that stage, we invented what we call the ice train, which is basically Winnebagos on sleds, as we call them. So, and then we can move across the glaciers in the winter period, and be very comfortable, very comfortable. So, it's something we built originally for major film productions, and we just used it for Mission Impossible. So instead of having your trailers on set, we had ice train on set, which basically Winnebagos on sleds. So
Now, do you have any? No, the last time when I had Billo on for Bill O'Leary,
yeah.
the author of the Southeast Asia pilot, he spilled a little tea on some celebrity gossip. Now, do you get any good celebrity gossip for us, Jason?
No, I don't know any celebrities.
Lies. Anyway, well, tell us about but there's one guy you can definitely tell us about. Tell us a little bit about David Attenborough.
Oh, David, yeah. David, he's also got a great love for Svalbard, which goes back before my time, actually. I think it was Life on Earth, one of the original series from the 1970s, it must have been, where he had the Arctic tern attacking him. And then, the Arctic tern is the longest traveled creature on the planet. It travels from the northern regions of Svalbard all the way down to the Weddell Sea. So David's, and you talked about the volcano ash being actually up on the northeast island on the glacier. They closed down the European airspace when we had the big volcanic eruptions in Iceland in 2010, and we just happened to be on Svalbard filming the opening sequences, the last sequences and the opening sequence for Frozen Planet 1 for BBC, the first Frozen Planet series. So David was opening the Frozen Planet at the North Pole, closing at the South Pole, but we're doing the opening sequence at the North Pole and then some work with polar bears on Svalbard. And then he was meant to leave the next day, and then they shut down the airspace. So he got stuck at my house in Longyearbyen for a few weeks, and the UK media was writing the headlines: Sir David Attenborough marooned at the North Pole. And David was laughing, going, "If only they knew how little red wine and chocolate we have left." Like we had copious quantities left. So,
well, I've seen your house. It's not a hardship.
No, it's not exactly a hardship, and the way they portrayed it in the international media was he was freezing to death at the North Pole because of volcanic ice.
You should have showed him the little cabin that you stuck Einar and Oscar in when they were filming it, where they had that was a great story. Was Einar was telling me that they were in there and they'd sleep with their ice axes on their chest because the bears would scratch on the walls.
On top, yeah. We have a lot of historical remains on Svalbard, which we haven't touched on, which I don't think people before they experience it are too interested in. But once they come to a place like this and you show them one of the old trappers' cabins, there's literally thousands of historical remains around Svalbard. There's hundreds and hundreds of dead people around Svalbard as well from the whaling period. So
it goes back to the Viking Age.
Yeah. And the original discovery, Viking, and then William Barron's proper discovery, Spitsbergen Island, and then you got basically that's 1,000 years ago, Viking, but the Svalbard is, in Icelandic, is Svalbardifundi, which is basically the find of the cold coast, which was the coastline of Svalbard. Whether they ever come ashore, we don't know. And then that was 1196, then 1596, William Burroughs, when trying to find the northeast passage, discovered Spitsbergen Island, and from then on, the whole 400 years until now, it's been different periods of exploration. And whether it was originally the northern European countries doing whaling for oil, and then there was a Polymor Russian fur traders period, and then there was a Norwegian turn of this century hunting period, mining period, then into geopolitics. So for 400 years, you've had activity on Spitsbergen, and they've left remains, which are now cultural heritage sites, which it's quite interesting to see. And we would land our tender on a beach because it's a smart place with a swell and rocks to get on that beach. And then you stand there and you go, well, Here, 50 years ago, 100 years ago was a Norwegian trapper. 200 years ago was polymer Russian fur trapper. 400 years ago, there's blubber ovens because they cooked the blubber. So there's no difference 400 years ago than somebody rowing a rowboat ashore to cook the blubber for the oil thought of the best place to beach land, the same as we do today.
Yeah, I thought like
Mm.
yeah, and even 1,000 years ago when the Vikings
Mm.
were
Yeah.
pulling up on that same beach.
Mm.
Now talking whales, I found I live on Cape Cod. We've right on Stellwagen Bank. We've got some of the best whale watching in the world. We've got a bounty of different species
Mm.
here. The only whale that I don't think haven't seen off Cape Cod is a blue whale. This is a when we were up in right around kind of that southeast corner
Yeah.
there. We
Oh, the
came
straight. Yeah.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
came across this guy, which was probably this was the biggest finback I've ever seen. We actually
Mm.
mistook it for
Oh,
a
yeah, it's a
blue
beautiful
whale,
finback. Yeah.
and it was just spectacular. It was
Mm.
that
Yeah.
was something else.
The increase of the large whale species in the last 30, 40 years is quite defined, whether it's reproduction or movement in areas. But Svalbard, has really, they started to return to the fjords and to the outer fjords, and it's quite common to see during the summer season blue whales now, where 20, 30 years ago we never saw a blue whale. We had to go maybe off down towards Jan Mayen, north of Iceland.
Yeah,
So the large whale species, whether it's bluefins, say humpback whales, have all they've all returned. And actually on Svalbard, we like the whole Arctic, we get a lot of negative media and climate change. We do have climate change, but protection of the wilderness by harvesting those large creatures has really paid back. The reindeer population, the first creature to be protected on Svalbard in 1925 was the Svalbard reindeer because they were nearly desecrated by hunting. And now we have closer to 27,000 is the estimate. So, as you saw, there's reindeers everywhere. You even driving through town, you have to stop to let them cross the road in front of you. So the large whales, I saw 3 blue whales 2 years ago from the beach 100 meters from the office. Just walk down the beach and watching 3 blue whales
wow.
all feeding in the bay, and you kind of think if we look after our planet, it can come back. So
And that segues beautifully on how I like to wrap up these talks that I do in different parts of the world. I've been fortunate to see a lot of different parts of the world, but I've also seen a lot of the devastation that's happened, and I guess maybe that's without even consciously realizing it is why that Svalbard to me was extraordinarily special. It was because of all the conservation that you've achieved up there, and to actually see it in action, to see the wildlife thrive, and to see the people around that wildlife thrive because of it. It's you don't have to destroy the environment you to live in order to live there. It's a really it was heartening to see. One of the one of the things that one of the projects that I'm working on right now, actually, and Jason and you and I have talked about this, is kind of the further adventures of latitude, or I might use hysteria, where we're actually going to go into these different biologically sensitive areas and show people exactly what good conservation can do, and take more of a like you said, take more of a positive spin on it. It doesn't take a lot to really bring the animals back and bring back the 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 wildlife, the flora, the fauna, and everything. It's just with just a little bit of effort.
No, I think Svalbard has been a place because of easy access. The reason you would like to cruise to Svalbard today is no different than the reason why the whalers come to Svalbard.
Yeah,
To be brutally honest,
true.
it's
Yeah.
ice-free West Coast Spitsbergen Island, ice-free Atlantic currents, relatively warm, creating lots of phytoplankton going all the way through to the polar bears and whales. So that's what we like to come to view today, and that was what the reason exactly why the whalers access Svalbard and not these more difficult locations to access. And walrus were protected in 1957 on Svalbard from being pretty much extinct. 30 years ago, I worked with research on walrus, and we spent a whole summer to find a handful of walrus. And then 30 years later, you go on your trip, and there's literally walrus on every second place.
Yeah.
It's
We didn't have to look too hard to find a walrus.
no. They actually, I can not use the word a problem, but we just did a cruise with three yachts, where the principal was into diving, and I was like, oh my god, okay, yeah, let's see how much problems the walrus make all the time, because everyone talks about the dangers of polar bears.
Oh no, walrus are way
way more dangerous, especially when you're diving or kayaking or stand-up boarding or anything like that. So yeah, this recent super yacht tour was very much around the diving, and literally every single day we had issues with walrus, which was a bit of a pain, but I did have to also think at the same time that 30 years ago we would have actually been trying out so hard just to see some walrus. So yeah, so most things on Svalbard in that sake is positive, and we have a lot of effect of climate change and warmer temperatures. We have a lot of glacial melt, so glaciers are definitely receding, which is in some ways, as I always say, where there's a loser, there's a winner. So recession of glaciers means more greener areas, more geese, more reindeer, more geese, more reindeer, more birds means more dead reindeers, which also means more Arctic foxes. So it's all a cycle. And then someone's asking there, how do you overcome the dangers of walrus? Well, walrus, it's interesting because they got about 1 inch thick skin, and then underneath that they got a lot of blubber, and then underneath that they got a big skull. So you could be unknowledge and take a baseball bat and try to hit the thing on the head, but it won't affect it at all. You just take a paddle and you just touch it on the whiskers, and it doesn't like that, and it pulls away. Simple as that. But you don't want to be in the water diving with them, because if you tickle its whiskers, it might be a bit nasty back at you.
Well, there you go, Used. Next time you're in Monaco and or in Amsterdam, the Used is with Repack, and it's great that he's on here, because they were one of the designers of there. We get some other questions too. We might as well answer just real quick. Jason, you'll recognize in the picture that's the view from your house.
Yeah, yes, it is. Yeah, and Hjortfjell, which is very much a classic, say West Spitsbergen, Eastfjord type of mountain range, very different than the other pointed mountains you had. Is there any time of year you would avoid this area altogether? Well, Svalbard has very much, because of the Gulf Stream and winter and the pack ice coming down, it really has a season for yachts. If you do have an ice classing, you could start as early as April, May. Without an ice classing, then it's really, so your season would start the earliest mid to late April and finish in the end of September. Whether you start early or late in that depends a lot on your ice classing. So, and where you want to access, because the northeast and the east side is not accessible early summer because of heavy pack ice, unless you got a major icebreaker. West Spitsbergen is accessible all season. So the main season is June, July, August.
The now on all the itineraries that are designed, and also too is Leanne Trisky asked, this is she writes
Mm.
itineraries, not menus, because she said, "Good morning. Will any sample menus be available to participants?" And actually, yeah, I mean, we could put together a nice Arctic Fair menu. Now, speaking of menus, in the itinerary, which if anybody wants, they can email me at Sean at worthavenueyachts.com. And yeah, and we will give this itinerary. But the best really with the Arctic is that the Arctic, what kind of we showed you was like a smattering of things. There might be some places on this itinerary where you're not going to be able to go, and then there's other places that we could go, and you've really got to just play it by ear. Now, attractions, which is at the end of the itinerary section there, I basically listed all the restaurants there in Longyearbyen, but I've also got PolarX, which is Jason's company. You can click on that link, and that will give you direct access to Jason Roberts, who's here, my co-host on this episode of Dive In with Captain Sean. Also, other things I like is that I get this is as a captain, I would get questions like, well, what happens if something went wrong and we had a medical emergency? There's a link there, which is Safety in Svalbard, which talks about the medical care that they have over there, how you would get medical care in Svalbard. Ideally, if something was really bad, we would medevac you from Longyearbyen, and it's only a 3-hour flight to Oslo, so it's not too bad. It's not like the Arctic, not like the Northwest Passage, where in best case scenario, we were 48 hours, best case scenario, we're 48 hours away from really good medical care. And then how to get to Svalbard, I have that in there. And then finally, forecasting is such a critical part of what I do. And for that, I use a company called seaweather.net. I encourage everyone I'm not sponsored by them. I just think their product is exceptional. And it was funny. They would actually call me because we were so high up in the Arctic at times that they didn't have good eyes on weather conditions. And so they really work with the captains that they have in their fleet, and they give excellent weather reporting. And again, if you want to contact me about this, Worth Avenue Yachts, or you can contact Worth Avenue Yachts directly, or myself. My phone number is right there, and then there's my email. And then if anyone has any other questions, we'd love to hear them. Or Jason, do you have any further comments on chartering? Like, now tell me a little bit about, you were telling me off camera about how the rules and the guidelines are changing rapidly for the Arctic.
I think so many regions in the world are becoming more and more accessible, and with more people becomes more guidelines and rules, of course. So for that, it's also time in planning to allow enough time to plan. Also, I'm very much, when we work in other regions, we also try to use as much local people as possible to get some feedback with you get some of the economy of what we do into the local community. I just see you talking about that VAT in Norway. Actually, that's an interesting one, because on Svalbard we don't have any VAT actually. So Svalbard is a VAT-free zone of Norway. So you have no VAT while you are chartering out on Svalbard.
And that's definitely, so it's not like chartering in the Med or anywhere else. It is tax-free to charter out of Svalbard compared to I'm going to do another series on mainland Norway, probably in October. I'm going to talk to Arnfinn and Arnfinn, the guys from Super Yacht Norway. Jason, you know them, obviously.
Yeah, we cooperate very closely. We're part of their group. So, a charter in Norway includes Norwegian VAT, unfortunately. So when's the best time to be able to go and see polar bears? Well, that prime period for cruising, any of that period, is a wonderful time to see polar bears. Basically, you can, of course, visit the islands during the winter period and not be vessel-based, but vessel-based is May, June, July, August, and September.
And then Diane, we covered this earlier in the video, but the ideal, well, I mean, I did 6 weeks up there. I could have easily done another 4. It was wonderful. But Jason, you'd say the ideal length is probably, I'd say 8 days to 2 weeks.
Yeah, somewhere between 8 days and 2 weeks. Less than 8 days, you're not going to be able to circumnavigate the islands because of distance. So anywhere between, average 10 to 12 days, but 8 to 14 days, anywhere 6-7 days, you're pushing the distances and might have to just stay Spitsbergen Island, not the outer islands. And pushing further to the outer islands is good for the wildlife.
Yeah, again, there's, even if you've got guests that they're like, well, that love to shop, actually really good shopping.
Yeah, I mean,
there really is. The stores are great, and there's actually really good galleries and local artists. I bought this. This is a local artist. I bought this plate. Can I get it on the camera here? Where it is?
Yeah, his wife her husband just tried to call me.
Oh, really? That's funny. But I love, there's some great, I've got some great old plates.
But that's the classic thing with Svalbard, where people think you're at the end of the earth and you're not in Longyearbyen. You're very much in a European city. It's the same you mentioned about search and rescue or medical evacuation. You are probably better serviced than most places in all of Europe or North America. We have 2 Super Pumas on 24-hour standby, 7 days a week, sitting at the base, one with full doctor support on board, like an air ambulance ready to fly. So, the furthest point away, you're an hour from the airport in Longyearbyen, an hour to fly out, an hour back. So 2 hours to the airport here, and you could be in the main hospital at Oslo in another 2.5 hours, 3 hours with the jet. So you could be medevac from the White Island to the hospital in Oslo in about 5 hours.
And that's it's what an amazing technological world we live in. Anyway, any final questions? If not, then Jason, what are your final thoughts on all of this and chartering in Svalbard? Or anyway, take it away.
Yeah. I love seeing more people coming to the Arctic, not only Svalbard, but the whole Arctic. I mean, I know that we've never had a charterer, but most of the yachts we deal with actually on the private market and the owners. But yeah, there's a lot of repeat customers, which is a good thing. So once people get the taste for expedition cruising, they tend to want to continue. Maybe go different phases in life. Maybe have children that don't want to go expedition cruising for a phase in life, and it changes. But the great thing is that it's definitely repeat customers, and that's because you are doing something very special when you cruise in these regions. You are doing something that most people never do. So you also have to step out of the box and want to experience these places. And I see there was a couple of comments about itineraries and that. And personally, it's a length of the cruise at the time of the year. I need a start date and an end date. We know every little bay, every nook and cranny, and then it's weather related where we go and what the guest wants to do. And we had one yacht here a few years ago where, with children on board, and we got some good wetsuits for everybody. And I never seen so many days of water activities. Paddle boarding around icebergs and playing around in the water all the time.
I'd throw on a dry suit and go. Some of the best jet skiing I've ever done is in the Arctic. When I was in Greenland, like the humpbacks were coming up right next to me, and then over at White Island, jet skiing through those ice fields is just utterly spectacular. You don't need a charter license to charter in Greenland.
No, you don't need a charter license. That's a quick answer to that one.
Yeah. Well, if that's it, I just want to say, Jason, thank you so much for. Todd.
Thank everyone for joining.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, good question, Todd. Anyway, so yeah, so this whole video, the second we go off live, will be on the Worth Avenue YouTube channel. So if you want to watch this, go to Worth Avenue Yachts on YouTube, and it will be under the live section. And then after, we'll probably also move one into the video section as well too. This is from Laura Yeager, our head of marketing. She says, "Thank you, Jason and Sean. Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much for making this possible, and thank you. And I'm glad this has been helpful. If you want to get in touch with me, you can follow me on my Instagram, and my Instagram handle is Excitement Factory. Also, every Tuesday night on the Up and Adam channel, I do a show called Anchor Watch, and my segment is Dive In with Captain Sean, where we talk about all things below deck and nautical. I know, I'm slumming it by doing that, but that's all right. It's fun. It's all about don't judge me. Anyway, once again, thank you very much, Jason. If you want to check out Jason, go to the PolarX website. His email, his contact information is there. And if you want to watch a really I'm something that I'm incredibly proud about. My first officer, Shelton Dupreez, follow Shelton on Instagram as well. He put together a film called The Highest Latitude. And if you go to YouTube and put in The Highest Latitude, you can see the voyage that Latitude had through Norway and through Svalbard. It's something really good. And on that note, that is what we're going to end with, a little bit of taste of The Highest Latitude and a sneak preview of what's coming up next on Dive In with Captain Sean. Thank you very much all for tuning in, and we'll see you later.
We're at 82 degrees almost north latitude, just about 500 miles from the North Pole, and about 15 of us have gotten off the boat and climbed onto an ice floe, and we're going to try and take some pictures and just horse around.